I and others write about the North Star myth, largely in the context of historicizing the Black experience in this country. So the North Star, of course, provided a guiding beacon for people who'd escaped slavery in the United States as they made their way on the Underground Railroad to Canada. So we can think of this as, the North Star as being the guide to freedom in a sense. And in Canada, we've liked to think of ourselves in large part as the terminus or the endpoint of the Underground Railroad. And our relationship to slavery and to Black history in this country is often thought about in the context of freedom. Negating the fact, for example, that slavery existed in Canada for 200 years, that 6 of the first 16 legislators of Upper Canada held slaves. And so instead of considering, and this is something we've done for a long time, our own relationship to slavery and other systems, other racial caste systems, we've liked to think of ourselves in opposition to the United States. And we have this kind of collective amnesia with respect to the horrible treatment of Black people in this country. When we talk about internal and perhaps settler colonialism, what we're doing is, describing the ways in which colonialism and colonization are still very much with us. So in a traditional colonial example, you'd have a state or a country who sends people to another country to basically dominate both the peoples and extract resources and goods, riches, whatever that might be from the colonized region or geography are largely sent back to, the benefits of colonization are sent back to the home country. In a settler colonial experience, roots are laid down, governments are established, and the colonizing power largely takes root. And so we can think about that in the context of Canada, of course, right? The British and the French both not only, engaged in a colonial project here, but that colonial project has stayed with us. And so in the context of discussions around internal colonialism, it really describes, the ways in which those colonial structures are maintained and the lives of the subjugated populations. So in Canada, we can think about Indigenous populations, but also other groups who were brought over as part of the colonial projects. The foundation and the roots of our country and of our system are based in the colonial period in large part, but that colonial period is still with us. And those roots still inform the ways in which our Indigenous populations, our Black populations, and other racialized populations are treated and how they're able to kind of navigate and exist within our societies. Maybe it might be wise to even take a step back and think about the ways in which colonialism, the subjugation of Indigenous populations, the experience of slavery and subsequently segregation kind of informed the historical and then now contemporary experiences of those populations. I think we need to consider, I've said kind of in a cursory manner that colonialism, slavery informed social, economic, and political relations. But I think, it's important to interrogate how those took place. So socially, colonialism, slavery are predicated on the idea that certain groups are inferior to others, or that certain groups are superior to others. So colonialism was, based on a system of white supremacy, and entrenched a system of white supremacy. So our Indigenous populations were seen as inferior and therefore could be dominated by the white population. The same was the case with slavery. You couldn't enslave other human beings. So African populations were quite literally dehumanized in order for them to be enslaved. So in Canada, we had the establishment of a social system in which white people were at the top of the social hierarchy, Black and Indigenous people at the bottom. And, we haven't had a clean breaking point from that social reality. And so that, the ideas of inferiority persist today. Now, if we think about what those systems did as well, in a political sense, certain people could hold office, others couldn't. And so we saw, especially, of course, in the early days of Canadian history, but even up into today, that there's an overrepresentation of white people in positions of political power in this country and have outsized kind of political influence, and then importantly economically as well, right? Like if we think about the example of slavery in particular, you've got one group of people, white Europeans, who are benefiting economically from the labor of the Black population, right? And so one group is being enriched while the other is literally, being impoverished and not benefiting from their own work. And this is why, laying this foundation is important, because when we think about like our distance from these systems, they're not as great as we might think. And so I often, talk about segregation. The law that allowed for segregation remained on the books in Ontario until the 1960s, and the last segregated school closed in Nova Scotia in the 1980s, right? This is another system which is designed to separate Black from white people and serve to further privilege white people in those social, political, and economic terms, right? That's within our lifetimes. That is not that far ago. And so segregation being practiced in Canada until the 1980s, of course, so the last residential schools in Canada didn't close till the 1990s. So again, just bringing that past so much closer to our present than many people like to appreciate. I'll start with child welfare. When we look across the country, in Toronto, for example, Black youth are grossly overrepresented in young people who are in care. So young people who've been removed from their parents. The same goes for Indigenous people across the country, right? Greatly overrepresented. We talk about the 60s scoop, but we now have a situation where Indigenous children are so vastly overrepresented in the foster care system that it looks like the 60s scoop all over again. And there are a couple of reasons for this overrepresentation. One has to do with relationships with poverty. And so there's a genuine concern on the part of the state that, certain families are unable to care for their children in an economic sense. But part of it as well has to do with ideas about what families are supposed to look like, who are supposed to take care of children. And so there's certainly perceptions of pathology within both Black and Indigenous families. My father's from Ghana. Where I'm from, we call our aunties, our uncles, our moms and our dads, right? That old adage that it takes a village to raise a child is really in practice. And so cousins play with one another as if they're siblings. The family unit really takes care of children, and that conflicts with kind of Western notions of the nuclear family. So we can see situations in which child welfare are alerted to older siblings, cousins, and more distant family relations taking care of children, and that not being seen as so acceptable, again, based on this ideal or norm of the nuclear family. And so this so increases the representation of Black and Indigenous people in the child welfare system. When we get to education, part of, as I'd kind of touched upon a little bit, the underlying reasons for both slavery, but as well as, the conquest of Indigenous lands, with this idea that Black and Indigenous people were inferior, intellectually inferior, less, kind of developed. And these views persist. So when we look at the education system, Black children, for example, are disproportionately likely to be streamed into non-academic tracked programs, based in part on a belief that they're not as they don't have the same intellectual capacities. This happened to me in secondary school. My English teacher in grade 11 told me that I should drop from the advanced to the general level because there's no way I could succeed at the advanced level of study. Now, only one of us has a PhD today, and it's not him, right? So thankful I had my parents to advocate for me, but those stories are just way too common. When we think about graduation rates, right? Black youth are much less likely to graduate for a number of reasons. One, because the curriculum doesn't appeal to Black children in the way that it does to white children, because they don't see themselves reflected in that curriculum. And then, of course, there's school discipline. So Black children being, this was especially true under the Safe Schools Act, but still persists to this day. The kind of playful or boisterous behavior of Black children is seen as problematic, again, based on ideas related to Black criminality. So when Black children act out, it's seen as a marker or a sign of future potential dangerous behavior, and they're treated much more harshly than our white children who engage in similar behavior. So we see, much lower levels of academic success, amongst Black and Indigenous children in this country, based part on beliefs about, intellectual inferiority, based part on beliefs about how children are supposed to behave, and based part on beliefs or based part on, what's actually contained in our school curricula. We've had, young people in the GTA as children in the GTA as young as 6 years old being handcuffed by the police, right? Because they were misbehaving and the police thought that they had no other way to deal with them. Now, I think I can say categorically there is no way that a white child in the GTA would have, a 6-year-old would have been handcuffed by the police in a school because the police didn't think that they could deal with that child. So it's unfortunate, of course, like poor academic outcomes would predict poor employment outcomes. And we see that. So, if you're less likely to graduate from secondary school, then that diminishes your employment opportunities, of course, right? Like now we're in a society in which post-secondary education is really, what's needed to be successful in many aspects of the workforce, whether that be college, university, or some kind of trade or training. And so if Black youth are being pushed out of school, as I think you very accurately described, then their chances of securing employment are, of course, diminished. That is compounded by the fact that we see systemic inequality in hiring practices as well, right? So there have been a series of studies conducted around much of the Western world, including in Canada for the last several decades, that use similar resumes, but with, for example, stereotypically Black and stereotypically white sounding names. And these identical resumes are submitted to jobs, these fictional applicant profiles. The most recent example, there was a master's student at the Center of Criminology at U of T, where I do some teaching, who created four fictional job applicants. These were women, 2 Black, 2 white. One of each racial group had a criminal record. So a white woman without and a white woman with a criminal record, a Black woman without and a Black woman with a criminal record. And these identical resumes, or almost identical resumes, were sent to retail jobs. And mirroring findings in the United States, when the results came back in, the white woman without the criminal record received the most callbacks, followed by the white woman with the criminal record. The Black woman without a criminal record received less callbacks for an interview than the white woman who had a criminal record. And the Black woman with a criminal record received almost no callbacks for an interview. So here we can see, of course, we can talk about the stigma of criminalization, but the stigma associated with simply being Black was enough to diminish the employment prospects of those fictional applicants. So we see systemic discrimination, of course, in hiring, and it goes beyond hiring. It also goes to promotion, to opportunities for training and other advancement opportunities within the workplace. And those, of course, poor employment prospects result in higher and greater experiences with poverty, right? And so again, we see this with both our Black and our Indigenous populations across the country, greater exposure to and experiences with poverty and with abject poverty. Not only lower levels of income, and it's not just living in poverty or having less money, but it's also the environments or the conditions in which you're more likely to live. So these would be neighborhoods and geographic regions where more people are experiencing poverty, where there are fewer accesses to much needed resources, whether those be good schools, libraries, community centers, adequate access to healthy foods. We talk about food deserts, of course, and this is where the opposite is concentrated. So we have higher concentrations of kind of problematic behaviors.